It's important that we talk about these things. Government overreached. We paid a price. If the reason can be demonstrated that you did what you did and you helped propagate disinformation, information that might have been a half-truth or a falsehood, deliberately used to deceive, if you did that, you have a special level of accountability. Our political leaders, the people who financially profited, the people who politically profited, gaining more control and power, if we don't do this, if we don't hold people accountable, you know as well as I do, there is nothing that will stop them from doing it again. Welcome back to the Dr. Scott Jensen podcast. Today, I want to talk about the devastation wrought by government overreach. And it's very appropriate that I start out with something I frequently start out with. This quote from George Orwell: "In a time of universal deceit, telling the truth becomes a revolutionary act." That's where we're at. We've had the kind of devastation by government overreach like I never would have thought possible. I've had several patients over the last couple of months tell me, Dr. Jensen, I always thought that I would leave this earth thinking that the transformative event in my life was the Vietnam War. But what we've seen during this pandemic, not only in the United States, but worldwide, and the nefarious agendas that drove so much of what happened, those patients told me that they think that the transformative event in their lives will now be the COVID pandemic and our response to it. Let's start out with just a little discussion about government. At one level, government seems like it would be the rule makers. They make the rules. They hopefully make the rules for our elected representatives. But if you look at the time of Galileo, the government then was more the church. In 1633, Galileo was prosecuted. Do you know why? Because he supported heliocentrism. You got to be wondering, what the devil's that? That's the astronomical model in which the Earth and planets revolve around the sun being the center of the universe, the Earth not being the center of the universe. The Inquisition declared that his belief was formally heretical. Ultimately, Galileo was sentenced to house arrest, where he remained until his death in 1642. For 9 years, he was in house arrest. I would submit that that was government overreach. Recently, we had U.S. Senator Elizabeth Warren acknowledge that there were unintended consequences, which are very damaging, from Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act. This is an article written in Blaze, and it says that Senator Warren and Republican Senator Mike Brown sent a letter to the Health and Human Services Department requesting an investigation into whether or not insurance companies are dodging the medical loss ratio. Well, what the medical loss ratio does is it basically requires health insurers to spend 80 to 85% of their revenues on medical care. In other words, they can't get this chunk of money from premiums and then spend this chunk on actual medical care and keep the rest for their profits. They've got to spend 80 to 85% on medical care. They're basically capping profits at some level. And the government felt that it needed to do that. And that was a part of Obamacare. But the Wall Street Journal came out with an article about this. What has happened is this rule that they have to spend 80 to 85% on actual medical care has inspired insurance companies to buy, merge, and affiliate with pharmacy benefit managers, pharmacies, and other key links in the healthcare supply chain. The result being a vertical integration of the drug market and the healthcare industry. This has allowed insurers to dodge the MLR, or the medical loss ratio. Elizabeth Warren, in her letter, said this: "The calculation is simple. By owning every link in the chain, A conglomerate like United Health Group, which includes an insurer, a pharmacy benefit manager, a pharmacy, and physician practices, can send inflated medical payments to its pharmacy. Then, by realizing those payments on the pharmacy side, the side that charges for care, rather than the insurance side, the insurance line of business appears to be in compliance with medical loss ratio requirements while keeping more money for itself. The Wall Street Journal described Warren's complaints in this letter as her Obamacare epiphany. The kind of devastation that comes from government overreach is seen time and time again. And here's just one example. Another one that I think is particularly important is recently there's been talk of Elon Musk. And one of the articles said, this was in the Star Tribune in Minnesota, what can anyone do about Elon Musk? They said, the question of how you solve a problem like Elon Musk has crossed the line from an amusing little parlor game to an issue with serious implications for anybody doing business with him, including major corporations and the U.S. government. Musk has been asked questions that have been at times challenging. Ultimately, he has spoken from his heart. He has not given advice that would cause someone to invest differently, someone to do their health care differently. He has simply spoken in the public square. He has basically said, I want Twitter, now named X, to be a public square platform where truly we can have the kind of hard discussions we need to have. He's pushing back against that devastation that comes from government overreach. You know, it's Elon Musk who has pointed out some of the values and advantages of electric vehicles and some of the downside. It's Elon Musk who has brought about some of the truly technological advances in regards to space exploration and making it more affordable. And yet we've got big media clamoring. Somehow they want to see Elon Musk muzzled. That's big pharma, big tech, big government, big media. That's overreach. In England, Tom Slater wrote about the war on disinformation is really a war on dissent. How many times have we heard, well, he's spreading disinformation or misinformation, and people don't even bother to make a distinction between the two, but there's a terribly important distinction to be made. Misinformation is information that ultimately proves to not be correct. Sort of like when I told you to take an aspirin every day to keep heart disease away when you turn 40. We did that for decades, but we don't do it anymore. Arguably, you can call it misinformation if you want, but disinformation is a deliberate effort to deceive with half-truths or falsehoods. Regardless, this article says the war on disinformation is really a war on dissent. And it says this, we need to retire the word disinformation. The definition of disinformation is false information which is intended to mislead. But the great disinformation panic of our time has sent into hyperdrive the paranoia of the pandemic. The word has come to mean something very different among our elites. It has come to mean inconvenient facts or differing opinions. Tackling disinformation is now just a euphemism for demonizing and silencing dissent. Take a look at this video, would you please?
I'm quite concerned at states and people who don't get vaccinated, Chris. The situation is so clear, the data affirm. If you get vaccinated, you are protected, even with the Delta variant, which, by the way, has a greater capacity to spread from person to person. And when you're infected, it has a greater likelihood of giving you serious disease. We know that as a fact from our own country, but particularly from the experience in the UK. The vaccines we have do protect well against the Delta variant. So if ever there was a reason to get vaccinated, it's right now, because we're seeing this Delta variant double every 2 weeks. We're up to 20.6% of the isolates now are Delta variants. A few weeks ago, it was like 2 or 3 or 4%. So we've got to get the job done. I mean, it's really unfortunate and somewhat puzzling when the data are right in front of you and you know exactly what you need to do to protect against these types of numbers, which you showed on the screen, and yet some people still are not getting vaccinated. That is very frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the question is what to do about it, right? So one of the things I think that is important to communicate in terms of risk here is that there's two parts of the risk, right? There's vaccination and your health and age profile, and then there's a rate of community transmission. But once community transmission starts going up, your risk is going up. That's true even for vaccinated people, but really true for young non-vaccinated people, I think, who a lot of have felt fairly immune from this, or fairly, in these places. Like we saw it in the UK. We saw hospitalization among young people go up in a way that was really quite distinct and worrying.
Right. Well, first of all, we are doing very well among people who are adults. I mean, if you look at 30 and over, we have greater than 70% of those people have at least one dose of a vaccine. So of that group, we're doing well. But you're absolutely correct, Chris. Yeah, you're absolutely correct. We need to focus on the 18 to 26-year-olds because that's the group that in England, you're absolutely correct. If you look at the Delta variant that has now surged in England, it's predominantly among younger people. So, it's kind of a mixed bag. If you look at the totality of the picture, the emphasis on vaccination that President Biden has made has been, quite frankly, overall very successful. We're almost at the 70% vaccination with one dose of adults when we reach the 4th of July. If we don't get it by then, we're going to get it within a week or so. But we don't want to stop there. That's an aspirational goal. The goal line is crushing the virus with as many vaccinations as you possibly can.
Yeah, and I just think this is where there's two worlds that spool out before us, which is, look, I've had you on the program many times now. I've been covering this as just a journalist and not a public health expert for 15, 16 months. But I know one thing. It's either going down or going up. The virus goes in one direction. Like, it's really growing or it's shrinking. Everything curves. And so when you start to see growing, then you start to think of a future in which the thing bops around in communities of low vaccination rates, sort of keeping this community transmission, maybe further mutations. And we also know what the last winter was like. And the difference between, right? I mean, am I wrong about that? That the difference between a fully vaccinated country and not going into the winter is massive.
Well, it's important if you're not vaccinated. If you look at the people, the states, the cities, the counties that are highly vaccinated, they're safe. Their risk is extremely low. What we worry about are the states you put up on the screen and the people in those states who are at risk for a variant that's quite problematic. That's the situation, Chris. If you're vaccinated, you don't have a risk. And that's the reason why we say it's as simple as black and white. You're vaccinated, you're safe. You're unvaccinated, you're at risk. Simple as that.
And speaking of silencing dissent, right now I'm involved with a lawsuit with the Minnesota Board of Medical Practice because I dared to dissent. During the time that vaccines were being pushed, I was asked to speak to the issue from a family practice perspective. And so I submitted a one-page affidavit in a court proceeding in another state. And I said this: per the CDC, there have been 42,429 deaths from all causes in Americans ages 0 to 17. Of those deaths, 248 tested positive for COVID-19. It is well known that a positive test is not a certain measure of COVID infection. It goes on to say, the CDC changed its guidelines to no longer accept test results in vaccinated patients with cycling thresholds of greater than 28. Thus, the more accurate number is not likely 248, but 54, who had a positive COVID test and pneumonia listed as the cause of death. But what these numbers mean, using either set of positive test values, whether you say 248 or 54, it gives us numbers that represent statistically zero chance of death for people between 0 and 17. This was data I reported. In a nutshell, I reported in this affidavit that if you look at all the deaths in Americans aged 0 to 17, and then identify which ones are related to COVID-19 and pneumonia, statistically, the number is zero chance of death for the age group 0 to 17. And what I concluded with in this affidavit was this. As a board-certified family practitioner, I would be directly affected by a change in FDA guidelines regarding vaccines for young people. An unwelcome consequence of using coercion to mandate the participation of healthy young people who are at a statistical zero risk relates to a possible reduction in the public trust in all vaccines.
A $100 savings bond in West Virginia, a $10,000 scholarship in Lancaster, California, free beer in New Jersey, donuts from Krispy Kreme, Shake Shack fries in New York City.
You just think of this when you think of vaccination.
And a drink in Connecticut. In a push to encourage Americans to get their vaccine, governments and businesses across the country are thinking outside the box. Recently, Ohio Governor Mike DeWine capturing much national attention. For Ohio residents who get their shots, the state is offering something in return, a shot at winning $1 million.
And the winner each Wednesday will receive $1 million.
And so far, state officials say the lottery has been a huge success.
This has been very successful. This past Friday was our highest vaccine administration day in 3 weeks. We were experiencing a 24% decrease week over week for those prior 2 Fridays. Last Friday, that age group saw a 6% increase.
Since DeWine's announcement, several governors following suit. To encourage residents to get the vaccine, Maryland Governor Larry Hogan also announcing a lottery with one grand winner to take home $40,000.
You guys weren't expecting that one, were you?
And New York Governor Andrew Cuomo announcing a $5 million grand prize as well. These types of incentives might just be the extra boost necessary for a country that rests on the brink of returning to a new normal. According to Dr. David Ash, a professor of medicine at the University of Pennsylvania, some rewards might work better than others.
What I like about the system in Ohio is that it trades on emotion. It's very exciting. And I think harnessing that kind of excitement towards this important social purpose is a really good idea.
He says a transactional incentive like giving a direct monetary payment for getting the vaccine might potentially backfire.
In creating a payment for something, you're saying, well, why do I need to get paid? Maybe this could elevate concerns that people already have.
Today, news media, social media, internet are filled with stories about standard vaccination rates dropping off, state after state after state. The United States has absolutely experienced a fracture in the trust that so many Americans had in vaccines. I think it gets to the point that the American people tried to comply to an overreaching government. First round of vaccines, CDC would tell you somewhere around 80% of people participated. The bivalent booster from 15 months ago dropped down to less than 20%. The current monovalent autumn booster arguably hasn't reached double digits in regards to all the people that are eligible or recommended for that vaccine. But an overreaching government took this affidavit and said, Scott Jensen, we're going to investigate you. You don't get to say something like that. You don't get to participate in a legal proceeding whereby you make a sworn statement sharing simply your perspective on what would happen. And I called it. I said, unwelcome consequence of using coercion to mandate participation of healthy young people who are at a statistical zero risk of dying of COVID-19 relates to a possible reduction in the public trust of all vaccines. I've seen it. I have seen it. Tetanus, diphtheria, pertussis, so many vaccines. Plummeting rates. An overreaching government. Well, Vinay Prasad, a physician who has a Substack, said this: entirely predictable. More parents don't want routine vaccines for their kids. The CDC has just reported that more parents than ever are getting vaccine exemptions for their children entering kindergarten. For many of us who have witnessed the CDC's repeated blunders with kids' COVID-19 vaccines, this result is entirely predictable. The CDC has lost the trust of the American people. An overreaching government squandered its credibility. An overreaching government said, we're going to lock society down. We're going to lock students out of school. We're going to lock nursing home patients into facilities infested with active viral disease, and we are going to lock down people's businesses and livelihoods. But a report came out. This is it. Here's the title. These experts advocated for lockdowns. Now they say they were wrong. Let's take a look at that.
Florida, what they did, they had the highest rate of death in COVID. Yeah, but they have the oldest people. And if you age adjust, it's no different than California.
Yeah, that's right.
If you age adjust, that was the right way to do it. He was right. Like, it's not, no one's saying that COVID's good. It was not good. But these people that did things that were not good for society, were not good for small businesses, were not good for people's mental health, were not good for the development of children's language skills. Like, all these things were wrong, man.
Well, look, I mean, there's so much stuff. It's going to be like a generation before we even see the damage from the lockdowns.
Oh, yeah.
And we won't even be able to know for sure what exactly, like trace it back to what exactly was the damage from the lockdowns. But just think about what a nightmare, 2020, I mean, there were riots in that year that were obviously about the George Floyd thing, but were very related to the lockdowns as well. Like, it wasn't a coincidence that after 3 months of being locked in your home with no bar, no sports, no friend's house,
lost your job,
no work,
right.
that then all of a sudden people were rioting, because cops have done, fucked up shit a lot of times before, and this one led to national, riots. That was all part of the cost of lockdowns. So the economy, the inflation that we're dealing with right now was a huge part of the lockdowns. And it was partly because they printed trillions of dollars as a result of being like, well, what are we going to do to make sure we're not in a depression if we just stop the economy right now? So, of course, the answer is always, well, we'll print trillions of dollars, hand out most of that to big corporations and give some crumbs to the American people. And so now you think of the cost of inflation. I mean, people are getting destroyed from the value of the dollar going down right now, and the cost of everything rising. These things are all interrelated, and it's like it's very hard to measure the cost of shutting down society.
No, and that should have been taken into consideration. The fact that it wasn't is so crazy, but everybody wanted to be safe. And the government, said we have to at least have an illusion that we're doing something to protect people.
Yeah. But really, I mean, in hindsight at this point, looking back at it, that if the government had just said, look, there's this virus, this nasty upper respiratory virus that's coming over here, and we think that if you're in very bad health, because this is like by March, it was very clear in the data of who was dying from this. It was very clear that it was old and sick people. This was right away.
But they focused a lot on outliers. They focused on young people. And a lot of those young people, unfortunately, were ventilated.
Yeah, well, that's true, too.
Michael Yo's doctor told him, I'm not going to put you on a ventilator because if I do, you'll die. And he got it early. He got it in like February. So it was early on. His doctor was wise enough, fortunately, to say, yeah.
Yeah, no, but I'm just saying if you were being honest and not focusing on the outliers and actually looking at like what we can learn from this data, they could have just said, look, if you are at risk, we really recommend you isolate yourself. For everybody else, try to be smart, try to be as healthy as you can, you know what I mean? And then if you feel sick at all, don't come into work. Like, do not power through it. Do not assume it's allergies or a cold or something like that. Like, make sure, get tested. And the tests weren't as readily available back then, but just stay home, wait it out. You know what I mean? Whatever. Just doing that and not locking down the economy and not having all of these crazy restrictions would have unquestionably been a much, much better way to handle COVID. Because look, from all these states, if you look at the lockdown states versus the non-lockdown states, or the lockdown countries versus the non-lockdown countries, if you look at the mask mandate counties versus the non-mask mandate counties, you can't draw any conclusion from any of them. The truth is that this virus just moved the way it was going to move. And so all you were doing was just destroying people's lives. Yeah. You were just adding more of a cost than the virus itself was going to add.
Why is it important for us to look at the confession of people who are now saying that they are wrong regarding the lockdowns? Well, in part, it's because an overreaching government political structure has been willing to lie. So when someone comes forward and saying they were wrong, we need to pay attention to their words. I want you to look at this clip. This is a clip of people, political leaders, government leaders, industry leaders, telling us that they never said that the vaccines would prevent transmission, that they never overpromised. Well, please take a look at this video and decide for yourself. Okay, so let's take a look at some of these leaders who said, we got it wrong. New York University professor Scott Galloway admitted he was wrong for supporting lockdowns. Quote, in retrospect, I was wrong. I was on the board of my kid's school during COVID. I wanted a harsher lockdown policy, is what he told Bill Maher. In retrospect, I was wrong. The damage to kids of keeping them out of school longer was greater than the risk. Newspapers all over the land are writing editorial positions exactly to that matter. He goes on to say, I'd like to think the governor and us, we were all operating with imperfect information and we were doing our best, referring to the Center for Disease Control. But that really wasn't the case. It wasn't just imperfect information. There was hubris, exaggerated confidence, cockiness, arrogance. There was hubris when some of these folks had the audacity to say, if you're not following me, you're not following the science. That's why we have to talk about this. I understand that many people in the trenches had viewpoints that proved to be correct or incorrect. I think that during the course of the pandemic, I had specific positions I took that were correct and sometimes they were incorrect. I still recognize the fact that early on I did truly believe that the origin of the Wuhan virus was most likely a natural event in nature, combining DNA from different species. I don't think that anymore. But the bottom line is we have some people who had potentially nefarious agendas. Now, what do I mean by that when I say nefarious agenda? I mean someone who's saying and doing what they want to do to, one, enhance their power, two, potentially control the situation, three, benefit from a financial perspective, and four, keep themselves out of hot water and not be held accountable. That's why we look at these kinds of comments. Kevin Bass, a 7-year medical student and researcher at a Texas medical school, said this. He said they were wrong, he was wrong, because of groupthink and fear-mongering. Groupthink and fear-mongering. You know what fear-mongering does? Is it creates an abusive relationship. Whoever's inflicting the fear gets to be in control and potentially abusive. Who's ever receiving the fear and seeing their logical mental processes compromised, they're abused. They're gaslit. That's what happened. The fear and lockdown started with the modeling. Mr. Bass said at the beginning of the pandemic, he was a hardcore COVIDian, meaning that he elevated COVID prevention and mitigation to an almost religious persuasion. And he said the Imperial College's modeling highly influenced his initial support for lockdowns. I remember in the Minnesota Senate, we were told that if we didn't do this, this, and this, we were going to have thousands and thousands and thousands of deaths, some 75,000 deaths. And we're going to have 1,000 a day in the month of July in 2020. Well, that was just silly talk. Mr. Bass said that the fact that significant organizations such as the World Health Organization reported that the case fatality rate was 3.4% scared him silly. 3.4% would mean for every 100 people that got COVID, 3 died. But it isn't 3.4%. Right now, the data indicates it's not even a tenth of that. It's more in the realm of 0.2 to 0.3, very similar to a fairly severe influenza winter in America. Bottom line is the modeling was flawed. Then we go on and we hear that from Dr. Jaffe that he felt that he had failed to recognize that loneliness, unemployment, and adverse childhood experiences are top risk factors for shortened lifespan, mental health problems, and chronic non-communicable diseases. Plus, he'd failed to recognize that missing school will affect an entire generation with reduced social development. And in the Minnesota newspapers recently, they came out and they said, our ACT scores haven't been this low in more than 30 years. And there's supposed to be progress, right? Dr. Ari Jaffe from the University of Alberta said, we must open up society to save many more lives than we can by attempting to avoid every case. That's why we have to look at these comments. Because, quite honestly, when someone is willing to say they were wrong, hopefully that can sort of create a different tone. But if it doesn't, there are other channels. Clearly, I'm accessing one of them by engaging in a lawsuit against the Minnesota Board of Medical Practice. What about the Texas Attorney General, Ken Paxton, suing Pfizer for fraudulent misrepresentation of its COVID-19 vaccine? Suing them. No, the question would be, well, you can't do that. Aren't the pharmaceutical companies given indemnification regarding liability? Possibly not. When there's fraudulent misrepresentation, that changes the game. Dr. Drew had an article, or if you will, a podcast on apologies. And Jennifer Say wrote an article about it. And the New York Times did as well on November 18th, 2023. Here's what the New York Times said. The evidence is now in, and it is startling. The school closures that took 50 million children out of classrooms at the start of the pandemic may prove to be the most damaging disruption in the history of American education. Dr. Drew, on his show, discussed the censorship, the reputation smearing, the harms done to children was not at all surprising from his perspective. Maria Van Kerkhoff, the acting director of the World Health Organization's Department of Epidemic, had this to say. The evidence pointed to what's sometimes called an immunity gap that was created by the pandemic. A dramatic reduction in circulation of other viruses and bacteria created a cohort of kids with few immunological defenses against bugs like influenza, RSV, and other cold-causing viruses, setting the stage for large outbreaks when those pathogens returned. And that's what we're seeing. So the head of infectious disease, epidemic, and pandemic preparedness, Maria Van Kerkhoff, is saying that we have done something that was not anticipated. And this is going to open up our young people to outbreaks, potentially of great intensity, that should never have happened. Do you remember in the pandemic where you would hear that, gee, flu was off the map, no flu anymore? None of this anymore. It was just all COVID, 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 COVID. Marie Van Kerkhove is saying, now we have an immunity gap. It's important that we talk about these things. Government overreached. We paid a price. We got to go forward, no question about it. And grace and mercy will play a part in this. I think one of the distinguishing features as we move forward in regards to accountability has to be, why? Why did you get it so wrong? Understanding that we get many things wrong, particularly in medicine. Eggs, aspirin, a variety of things. We change our tune. But if the reason can be demonstrated that you did what you did and you helped propagate disinformation, information that might have been a half-truth or a falsehood, deliberately used to deceive, if you did that, you have a special level of accountability. You have to. Our political leaders, the people who financially profited, the people who politically profited, gaining more control and power, if we don't do this, if we don't hold people accountable, you know as well as I do, there is nothing that will stop them from doing it again. They lied to us. That's what I'm hearing every day from voters and patients. They lied to us.
We cannot require someone to be vaccinated. That's just not what we can do.
They told us there would be no mandate.
Definitely not. You don't want to mandate and try and force anyone to take a vaccine. We've never done that.
Remember this one?
Our interest is very simple from the federal government, which is Americans' privacy and rights should be protected.
Well, how about this one?
Needless to say, the right of women to make decisions about their own bodies is not negotiable.
They told us that they would never do this.
It is a matter of privacy to know who is or who isn't.
This is one of my favorites.
You don't want to be mandating from the federal government to the general population. It would be unenforceable and not appropriate.
And this one was so crystal clear.
The federal government should step in and issue mandates, and if not, are you putting the needs of unvaccinated people ahead of the needs of vaccinated people?
Well, I think the question here, one, that's not the role of the federal government.
And then there's this one, the creme de la creme.
No, I don't think it should be mandatory. I wouldn't demand to be mandatory.
Folks, I don't care if you're on the left or the right or the middle, but we should all be concerned that we have been lied to. We have been told over and over again, there'll be no mandate. We wouldn't do this. Mandates are immoral. There's been so much flip-flopping, but I'm not flip-flopping. I'm going to tell you this now, as I've said in the past, and I'll say in the future. A vaccine mandate is immoral. Absolutely immoral. And why am I so concerned about this? Because there's no question in my mind that different folks had different reasons for saying what they did. But there's a certain group of people who benefited either financially, power-wise, control-wise, whose agenda, I believe, may well have been nefarious. That's why I wrote a book called We've Been Played. We have been played. If you want to get the book, you can get it at drscottjensen.com. The bottom line is, we need to pay attention when people come forward and literally apologize and acknowledge their wrongness. Some mercy and grace might be called for. But let's remember, there's a special kind of accountability that has to happen for those people in power who are making the decisions, who can be demonstrated to have deceived knowingly and deliberately the public. If we don't do that, without question, we're susceptible to that happening again. In fact, we could go stronger than that. We can say we probably bloody well know it'll happen again. And that's why we stand together. We stand side by side and we call for accountability. We can be gracious. We can be merciful. But at the end of the day, we will hold people accountable, and we will do that by declaring in one voice, never again.